stable. More people die from anorexia than they do from any other mental illness. And that's really important to remember, that time is of the essence, and your intervention when you are intervening is got to be really, really focused.
Hello, and welcome to another HG podcast. I'm Jo Baker, and I'm part of the HG team. Today, I'm going to be talking to our expert, Martin Dunne, about working with anorexia and why we shouldn't be focusing on food. Martin's a human givens therapist, and he's got a successful private practice in a dedicated multi-disciplinary holistic clinic. And Martin's really got extensive experience working both with groups and individual psychotherapy with young trainees in REHAB, and currently in Ireland's largest addiction centre. Martin's worked now for over 10 years helping people to overcome trauma and addiction and eating disorders. And we're really delighted to be discussing his work with eating disorders today. Hello, Martin. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, very good morning to you, Jo. Very good morning. Pleasure.
Martin, I wonder if you could start by telling us a little bit more about yourself and the work that you've been doing to help people to recover from eating disorders.
Yeah, well, as you said, I've been working for over 10 years as a human givens therapist, and I hold a degree in sociology and a master's in human givens psychotherapy. And eating disorders is something, it's almost like in one of our emotional kind of needs is the need to be challenged and stretch ourselves. And this was one thing that was paramount in my mind in coming to eating disorders. And it happened quite by accident, is that I work in a place called Carlow, which is about an hour drive outside of Dublin, a little country town of about 40,000 people. And one day, a woman just called me and she said, listen, will you see my daughter? She has been diagnosed with anorexia, and would you see her? And at first, I kind of shied away from it a bit because sometimes we can become really comfortable in our work and just go by rota almost, is that we feel comfortable in dealing with certain kind of issues and difficulties that people come to us with. And I said, no, I will definitely see her. And the woman was really in a bad way and had tried lots of different kind of avenues with her daughter. So her daughter came in, and I had a bit of trepidation because I'd never worked with somebody with an eating disorder before. And I was quite shocked. I was quite shocked as this young woman walked in, and she had a sleeveless t-shirt on, and there were gouge marks in her arms, and huge self-harming had been going on. And she announced herself by her appearance really as an emaciated young woman and quite fearful. And I invited her in. I tried to build some rapport on the way down of the yes sets and so on, which didn't work. Came into the office. I invited her to sit down, and she refused to sit down and looked at me and she said, and what do you do that's different?
Gosh.
And I said,
that was a challenge for you, Martin.
Yeah. I said, okay, this is what I do. I'm a human givens therapist, and essentially what we focus on is the unmet emotional needs, and if the needs are out of balance in some way, and also the person's resources. And I just gave her some of the patter and so on. And she smiled at me and she said, well, okay, then I'll stay for 40 minutes. So she sat down, and rapport was really, really difficult because, you know, she wasn't interested. She'd been around the houses with different hospitals and different therapists and different doctors and psychiatrists and so on. Anyway, I endeavored. And one of the things that instinctively came to me in that session was that when I did mention food, there was absolute resistance and a clamming up almost. It was almost somebody who was really protective of something that they held dear to them. So I soon learned for the rest of that session not to talk about food at all. Anyway, to cut a long story short, with this woman, we did make a lot of progress. Now, the kind of thing about eating disorders per se, everybody's different and everybody comes at this from a different point of view. And every client is different. And as we know, circumstances alter cases. So it is about being creative first and foremost. And I just really like to emphasize that for human givens therapists going in to work with people with eating disorders is creativity, and your own life knowledge experience can sometimes be really, really helpful. But being creative, thinking outside the box, and never giving up hope, and having an abundance of patience and tolerance and so on with a person with an eating disorder. Because at the least sign of rejection, they clam up and they won't return, or criticism, they will not turn up again. So with this young woman, anyway, to carry on, finish off that story of why I became interested in this field, is that I felt that I was making progress with this young woman. And she seemed to, I gave her a couple of tasks in between sessions and so on, outside the box again, going to art galleries, finding a particular picture to focus on, to write down a couple of lines to about the picture and what the picture meant to her and so on. And those tasks she seemed to enjoy those, because hitherto her coming to see me, she spent most of her time at home brooding and wouldn't go out, and lost all social contact with friends and so on. And any activities were just not there anymore. And I felt this was probably a creative way of getting the person back into getting their emotional needs met, for connection to people, for a bit more attention, for something to excite their brains and to focus away from the eating disorder itself. And it worked a treat with this young woman. And I was quite successful. We were quite successful in getting her back to eating in a healthier way. Now, the success in eating disorder kind of work is far and few between. Sometimes all we can do is put a little dent in the thing itself, is to make a little bit of difference. But I'm a great believer in the human givens approach, that even one session has laid down the seeds of future kind of harvests, that no matter how little time you spend with somebody with an eating disorder, it is of great value. And sometimes we as therapists, certainly in my younger days of starting our practice, when somebody wouldn't turn up for a second session, I would get worried and would take it personally. Now it's water off a duck's back. People don't turn up, it doesn't really matter, because I know the power of the human givens model and method, and the ethical approach that we take to therapy does make a difference to people, even in one session.
Absolutely. So true.
Yeah. Pardon me. Go ahead, Joe.
No, I was just, so true. So much can be done in just one session. And it's, I think like you in the early days, I felt that if somebody didn't come back, then, I couldn't have done a very good job. But actually, it's not our business to know that. And, quite often people go away and start to do their own work. And that can be that first domino, can't it? And it might be that then they come back, certainly was the case for me, that they come back, maybe even a year later, and they've actually got to the point where they are more ready now to do some further work.
Yes, indeed. And it's that kind of freedom that allows people choices, because at the end of the day, I mean, that's what our emotional needs are about. And in particular, our emotional need for control is about choices, isn't it?
Absolutely. And something that's so important for people who are, struggling with eating disorders or disordered eating.
Yeah. And one of the questions that you had, Joe, was kind of, why do people develop eating disorders? And it's an absolutely brilliant question, and I've thought about that, and I've thought, well, actually, what is it? The same question could apply, I suppose, to people who become alcoholics, or people who become drug users, and for eating disorders, and in particular anorexia. And a lot of our conversation will be around anorexia, although we might talk about bulimia and binge eating disorders as well. But in particular, anorexia, there seems to be a pattern. Firstly, there's a profile that goes with anorexia, and that is that most of them would be young women between the ages of 12 up to 18 or 20. It's different for bulimic; they start a bit later, and they seem to come from stable, and the researchers are agreed on these. They come from stable home environments. They're really good at school, really bright, into sports, and their parents would describe them as model children, not a problem at all. But it seems that when and the onset of puberty into adolescence, into the teenage years, something happens. Now, for most young people, this time of adolescence into the teenage years can be a difficult time with brain development and physical development and so on. But something seems to happen with anorexic people is that there seems to be an enormous amount of pressure that comes on them. Now this would be the same for all women in situations of having to match up through the social media, through size zero, to the models, to the bombardment of the perfect body and so on. But it seems a bit more than that. And it's almost like a dissatisfaction with the body, leading to body dysmorphia, which a person looks in the mirror and what they're seeing is not a normal body shape, but rather a fat person, an overweight person, where in fact, in reality, they're average size for their age. And that seems to be a preoccupation with this pattern that drives anorexia. And then this other thing about strained social relationships, seeking to please people, finding emotions that they feel difficult to tolerate, and not coping well with disappointment, never learning the thing about failure in life. It's all about perfectionism. And Hilda Bruch, who is an expert on anorexia from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, writes about the fear of growing up almost, is that there's an intense kind of fear about moving from that teenage, adolescent years into the adult world, is that it's just too daunting and we'd rather just freeze it in the moment of adolescence and the teenage years. And again, that perfectionism, it's almost like a compulsion to be better than everybody else, to be brilliant, and not dealing with disappointment or setbacks in life. So that is kind of the profile that kind of moves in to creating disordered eating.
And I think from working in universities for a number of years now, we've certainly seen a rise in perfectionism in our young women coming through. And with that, a rise in disordered eating behaviours as well. But also some young men coming through as well with problematic, eating behaviours, both overeating, undereating. And the concept of bigorexia as well, of people needing to bulk up and be bigger than the next person that they see.
Yes, absolutely. And it's almost like an innate kind of pressure almost, if I'm not perfect enough, I am not thin enough. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like an obsessional kind of thing around this body image kind of thing that's driving the whole process along. And then the whole thing around food as well, And I know we're going to come to the emotional needs and stuff like that, and the important kind of thing around emotional needs in relation to this.
Absolutely. And, there's so many different types of eating disorders, as we've discussed, but, all of them are around, getting needs met in balance at the end of the day, aren't they? So, can you tell us a little bit more about how crucial it is to be working in that way with people?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a search for identity, where it becomes a narrow focus on body weight, shape, and dietary restrictions almost. I mean, the research shows that the majority of sufferers come from stable environments, as I said, and the initial weight loss period is often expressed as highly rewarding, with increased strength, energy, vitality, in the presence of few negative emotional, psychological, or social consequences. In other words, there's a huge reward going on. And that sense of control over hunger and then eating and then the body is a core and central feature in anorexia. And it is highly rewarding.
And people quite often get praised as well, don't they? Initially, oh, have you lost weight? You look good.
Absolutely. Or you're a size zero. You look amazing. You look incredible. And then as the weight begins to drop off and then it becomes another source of attention, whether it's welcome or not, it comes from the families then, the loved ones who are concerned and fearful because the weight is beginning to really fall off. And then sometimes the emotional need for security is assured by an obsessive adherence to the drive for thinness through non-eating. So there's almost a security by not eating. And many anorexics, and this is certainly true in all of the anorexic or people with eating disorders that I've treated. They are absolutely obsessed with cooking. They enjoy making meals. They collect recipes. It becomes like their job.